Welcome again, everyone, to the Association for Diplomatic Studies and Training. It's a virtual panel discussion today on the Peace Corps. My name is Mark Rincon. For those of you who don't know me, I'm an active duty Foreign Service officer here with ADST. And as part of ADST's mission to strengthen public appreciation of American diplomacy and enrich professional knowledge by capturing, preserving, and sharing the experiences of US diplomats, we have series like these that feature policy experts who contribute to our storytelling via discussions like today's. We invite you to learn more, support our efforts, and sign up to preserve your own oral history at adst.org. So today we're continuing the commemoration of the 60th anniversary of the founding of the Peace Corps, and we're following up on the virtual screening of the Peace Corps documentary, A Towering Task. So today our panel discussion, the broad theme is the Peace Corps at 60, during which we hope to examine where the agency's been, its current state, and where we go from here. So I'm pleased to welcome our moderator today is Daniel Skullenberg. He's a veteran ADST intern, a graduate student at Georgetown University, and a former Peace Corps volunteer himself, having served in China. So I'm sure we're in for an insightful discussion. I'm happy now to turn it over to you, Daniel, to introduce our panelists, and let's get the discussion started.
Thank you very much, Mark. It's an honor to moderate this discussion and to have such an excellent group of panelists to talk about this topic, the Peace Corps at 60, to talk about the Towering Task documentary that we all were able to see over the weekend, and to really commemorate the enduring connection to the Peace Corps and the Foreign Service. And to get right into it, our panelists include Ambassador Frank Almaguer, Dr. Jerry Leach, and Don Camp. Beginning with Mr. Allmeger, he was a Peace Corps volunteer in Belize back in the 1960s. At the time, it was called the British Honduras, and that led him into a long career in the Foreign Service. And in the Foreign Service, he was able to work for USAID and also worked as an attaché in the Peace Corps programs in Honduras and Belize, first as a training director and also as the country director for Honduras. And later, in 1999, he became the ambassador to Honduras, and still throughout his career maintained that involvement and the support to the Peace Corps, and supported the volunteers in his time as ambassador in Honduras. Dr. Jerry Leach, also a returned Peace Corps volunteer. He previously served as a volunteer in Turkey in the mid-60s. And later, he got his PhD from Cambridge University and then joined the Foreign Service subsequently. And in that time, he was able to advise the State Department, the National Security Council, and also from 1989 to 1993 was the regional director for the Peace Corps programs in, I needed to write this down, Eastern Europe, Soviet republics, the Middle East, Asia, and the Pacific. Hard to know what else is left out. Yeah, and that was a historic time where you saw the creation of over 20 new Peace Corps programs after the Cold War, and I'm looking forward to hearing about that. And then finally, we have Donald Camp. He was also a Peace Corps volunteer in South India. And that led to a long career in the Foreign Service, a deep expertise in South Asia, which he was able to apply in positions in the State Department, National Security Council, and also at the US mission to the United Nations. And he also served abroad in his Foreign Service career at the embassy in Beijing as a political affairs officer, and also he was the Consul General of the American Consulate in Chengdu. All right, these are our panelists, and we'll get the discussion going with a question that's directed to all the three of you. Please don't hesitate to jump out and answer this question, and it's really easy. The Towering Task, the documentary. We saw the history of the Peace Corps, and in many ways it touched on the Foreign Service. What are your impressions? How did you see it, considering your experience and the impact it had on the US and also your life? We can start in the same order as I introduced you, Ambassador Allmeger.
Okay, well, very good. Thank you. First of all, thanks to ADST for hosting this event. A number of other organizations have been also celebrating the 60th anniversary of the Peace Corps. And it is noteworthy that an organization that was not expected to survive the Kennedy presidency is now celebrating 60 years. In fact, one of the funny elements of the documentary was the comment that President Kennedy told Sergeant Shriver that the reason he was appointing him is that when the agency failed, it would be easier to fire a relative than somebody else. The expectations really were not favorable to an organization that had so many doubters, beginning with our colleagues at the State Department in USAID, who saw sending a group of amateurs to do the professional work of diplomats and foreign aid workers as something that was potentially very risky. So the film, I think, has done a very good job of capturing, particularly those early years in that history, that we should always keep in mind. The other element of that early year that caught my attention in the documentary and in the history books is that this was proposed, obviously, during the campaign. By March of 1961, the president had signed an executive order. And in September, the Congress had approved legislation. And by later that year, Peace Corps volunteers were descending from airplanes in Ghana and in Colombia. You can imagine doing something like this today. It's almost impossible to do something like this. The other aspect of the film that is important to recall is that the best way to tell the Peace Corps story is by individual stories. It's the individual impact that makes the big difference, and it has captured a number of those stories that are worth telling and repeating. And every time I get together with people who have served in the Peace Corps, both staff and volunteers, new stories come up. I won't bore you with one that I heard yesterday, but I thought it was just wonderful, about remembering Peace Corps volunteers in Afghanistan and elsewhere. We know that they had an impact. I often have told a story, and I see Lisa Kabisky is there, you should appreciate this. When I presented my credentials as ambassador in Honduras, the then president of Honduras, after going through the formalities, we had a chit chat. And he said, I was really worried when I heard that the US was appointing somebody from the Peace Corps to be ambassador here, because it's always dangerous when the American embassy knows more about the country than its politicians. And Peace Corps volunteers know the country better than anyone. Perhaps that was an exaggeration, but it is a reflection of the reality that Peace Corps volunteers around the world go into communities that are far removed from the thinking of the capital and the politicians. And we've done a very good job. Now, one of the other elements of the film that caught my attention is that one of the concerns early on, and it was a legitimate concern, is that these individuals, idealistic, would go into these communities and perhaps promote causes and ideas that would run counter to US foreign policy interests. And the example that we saw in the documentary involving the Dominican Republic, with the US military going in at a time when, in 1964, at a time when President Johnson was determined to ensure that there would be not another communist country in the Caribbean. And it shows the Peace Corps volunteers at the time, including subsequent Senator Chris Dodd, working with the community on the other side of the fence, if you will, making sure that they had food and medical provisions and otherwise work with those communities with whom they had related over the years, over in some cases, short time they had been there. And there was mutual trust. The volunteers and the community, certainly the community saw these volunteers as people who enjoyed their food, enjoyed their camaraderie, enjoyed drinking beer with them, enjoyed the food and the lifestyle, if you will, while providing some legitimate assistance. And so that trust that developed at that time is something that has continued to characterize Peace Corps over time, which is individuals making a difference in a community, developing that kind of relationship that is so essential to helping us understand them and them understand us. So after all of these years, those original goals of the Peace Corps continue to be as valid today as they were 60 years ago. I could go on about other elements of the documentary, but I think it certainly has done an excellent job of recounting the ups and downs of the Peace Corps over the years. And one last comment with regards to finances and number of volunteers. If in the film, it was said that some of the early visionaries saw 100,000 volunteers. They managed to get 10,000 or thereabouts at the high point. And by the time the volunteers were evacuated a year and a half ago as a result of COVID, we were at about 7,000 or so. The budget in 1961 was $40 million. The budget in 2019, I guess, it was 400 million. Now the 40 million in 1961 dollars, 400 million in 2019 dollars means that probably Peace Corps was operating with less money in 2019 than it was in 1961. And yet, despite that, despite oftentimes being forgotten by the policymakers, Peace Corps has thrived and continues to be an important element in providing the three things that it was asked to do, which is to help Americans provide support and assistance in technical areas that may be beneficial to the communities, helping those communities understand Americans and vice versa, helping Americans to understand people who oftentimes live far away from US embassies and expatriate communities, and who will be able to understand a bit better something about our country and our culture and our hopes and expectations for them and for us. Good movie, good film.
Frank, thanks so much. Jerry Leach speaking. Good to see you again. I enjoyed your points. Several of them I enjoyed myself. I wanted to speak to the documentary as well. I just mentioned that I'm myself a documentary filmmaker, at least during the period of my adult life when I was a academic. And first of all, I like the film. I don't think there's anything quite like it. There have been other films on the Peace Corps, but not this comprehensive review of the whole entire agency and what it does. That film is really needed and should be helpful to the Peace Corps and to the American public in a lot of different ways. There's two things to me that really need to be added to the film, added towards the end or at the end. And that is the section, which won't be easy to do, but is very important. And that is a section on what the Peace Corps and its efforts over 60 years have amounted to in serving the countries that it's been in. That is 143 countries over the history of the agency in 60 years. So what have been our achievements, if you like, in those 143 countries, or more particularly in the 61 countries the Peace Corps is still in right now? And the second of those two, to me, missing elements is, what has the Peace Corps contributed to American society? In other words, what has it in fact brought back home? What occupations has it bolstered? What careers has it changed? What achievements has it had, etc.? And in other words, what has the Peace Corps been? What is its impact on American society, which of course was regarded as likely activity, something that could be expected to happen, but wasn't expected to be, I think, as significant as it is, etc. This is, I think you call it, the third goal achievement. So those two things I would add. In order to scope down and get the film within 2 hours, make it easier to show, I also probably would cut down on the amount of the creation of the Peace Corps at the beginning. That seemed to me to be a little bit long. Also, the film ends before the volunteers are evacuated in 2020, if you like. So the Peace Corps during the period of evacuation, that is a total evacuation, of course, was absolutely unique in Peace Corps history. And what happened and what the consequences of that were in starting the Peace Corps back up, what were the ins and outs of that? It's going to be essentially a little bit like starting all over again, but I'm sure it's going to happen. The question is only when, and obviously the virus and what its impact is and what the vaccination efforts of the different countries are is going to play very strongly in when the programs get going again. But I think it will be an interesting part of the story to add, the Peace Corps and COVID-19. With that, I think I'd like to praise the editor and say, really, really good job, and off to the races. If you can add to it, please do.
Well, I will continue the narrative by saying that I also enjoyed the movie, the documentary, very much. It was very comprehensive. I realized how much my view of the Peace Corps is focused on the early 1970s when I was part of it. And it's changed a lot, much for the good, sometimes not quite so much. I'd just like to focus on two areas that kind of spoke to me. One was the Santo Domingo episode that Frank mentioned, the safety that the volunteers felt in their home villages or towns. In the more risk-averse society we have now, those volunteers would have been pulled out so fast you would never have seen them before the Marines landed. I in the later years in the State Department was involved in the departure of Peace Corps, to everyone's regret, from both Nepal and Sri Lanka, in both cases temporarily, because of Maoist insurgencies in one and a civil war in the other. I think those volunteers felt the same way as the ones in Santo Domingo. They felt safe. They were part of the society. When I was in the Peace Corps, the only incident that I had that was remotely similar was the Bangladesh war between Pakistan, and Bangladesh, and India intervened on the side of Bangladesh, and the U.S. decided to support Pakistan. And the result was, suddenly, my life was interrupted by police coming to my home or my apartment and checking to see whether my Sony shortwave radio was in fact a two-wave radio that I was reporting back home on from rural South India, 2,000 miles from the war scene. So I think that affects a lot of people, and that was my experience the only instance of problems with my presence, I think, in 2 years in India. The other section of the documentary that I really liked was the discussion of those who who had been affected by Peace Corps volunteers. There was quite a bit of their time given to a fellow named Kul Gautam, a well-known Nepali diplomat and international civil servant. And he talked about, it was the first foreigner he'd ever met in his village and how it affected him. Again, you encounter people all over the world like that who knew a Peace Corps volunteer, remembered him or her 40 years later, and is still affected by that experience. I think that's really important. And I will stop there and we can continue. Thank you.
Those are great comments. Thank you. I also really like the movie and the documentary as well. And it is difficult, I know, to include all aspects of that history into a single hour and a half. But, you know, I do think that it is something that can be built on in the future. I do hope that every 5 years, every 10 years at the most, we can have another piece of that history all recorded, because as you move into the future, perspectives on the past do change, and we do see it in terms of the situation today. I do want to go back to the connection from the Peace Corps to the Foreign Service. One thing that stuck out to me during the documentary was the mention that early on, the heads of aid agencies, some diplomats, they also didn't like the idea of the Peace Corps. They thought those children would just get in the way of it. They'd get in the way of the professional aid work that was taking place. And I think that changed quite a bit in subsequent years. And I also want to highlight something that Ambassador Allmeger said. Early on, there was the idea to go big, put 100,000 volunteers in the field. You know, there was that urge, and I think it does go back to the purpose that in some ways President Kennedy envisioned for the Peace Corps. One quote that I love that is recalled by Harris Wofford was that Kennedy said to him in shortly before he went off to Dallas, actually, that, you know, this Peace Corps is going to be really serious when we have 100,000 volunteers a year, because in 1 decade, we'll have 1 million Americans who will have firsthand experience in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Then at last, we'll have an intelligent foreign policy, because there will be a big constituency of people who understand the world. And I think that's great. And I think that diplomats did come to see just how the Peace Corps enriched the Foreign Service with a great number of experienced individuals who had the language skills, the extensive lived experience in foreign countries that you can't get from studying abroad or even great courses in our universities. And so I want to open up, ask you all again, maybe in your time in the Foreign Service, how did the Peace Corps sort of build that connection to the Diplomatic Corps of America?
Well, I guess following would you like us to follow the same pattern?
Sure.
It's significant that at one time, and I don't know what the current figures might be, but at one time, no less than 10%, perhaps more, of the Foreign Service, both state and AID, were returned Peace Corps volunteers. In fact, I would like to believe that it was much higher than that.
Actually, may I interrupt and say, my understanding that it's now at about 15%.
Okay, well, good. That the more the merrier, if you will. We now have had a number of ambassadors who have been not only Peace Corps volunteers anywhere, but Peace Corps volunteers in the country of assignment. Bob Gelbart comes to mind. He was a Peace Corps volunteer in Bolivia, and then subsequently went in as ambassador in the same country. It has offered a head start, if you will, to diplomats and aid workers who come in with an understanding, at least, of how the dynamics of communities in developing countries operate, which is not the same dynamic as the politics in the capital city, which is where most of us as diplomats spend our energies and time. Understanding the country requires knowing more than the heads of government or CEOs of companies. It requires an understanding of the people in that country. Certainly the language skills. Although I often joke about what happened to me, that I filed my application to be a Peace Corps volunteer and pointed out in the box where it says languages, I said, I'm a native Spanish speaker. So they invited me to go to Sri Lanka. I think it was called Ceylon at the time. And I wrote back reminding them that I spoke Spanish fluently. So they said, yes, that's right. So we're going to send you to British Honduras. So I better not continue arguing with Peace Corps about assignments, because they probably will reject me. But so I wound up going to an English-speaking country. But in any case, certainly in my case, it opened up a vision of what I could do. Because I knew that I had a keen interest in international relations, in diplomacy, in history, geography. But how do I focus that interest into something that becomes a career? And eventually, not only working for the Peace Corps on the staff side, but also working with AID as a Foreign Service officer in the development arena. The Peace Corps service was invaluable. And again, understanding the dynamics of what tends to work or not work, and the suspicions that the people were trying to help have for what comes in to them from the outside. So clearly the Foreign Service gains a lot from having former Peace Corps or retired or returned Peace Corps volunteers. There are no former volunteers. They're retired. They're returned Peace Corps volunteers in the service to basically provide a set of understandings that make the job not only easier, but also more productive as they do what we do, preparing studies and analysis, writing cables, designing projects. All of those things with the Peace Corps background is enhanced significantly. And so my recommendation to both agencies, state and aid, and perhaps others, is that they continue to look for the RPCV community as an important source of future diplomats and professionals in the development arena.
Thank you again, Frank. My experience with the Peace Corps and the Foreign Service is quite interesting in a way, and spans over, what shall I say, 4 decades. At the time I was a volunteer, the Foreign Service officers, who obviously went out on different assignments and meeting people around the whole of Turkey, they were really instrumental in helping the Peace Corps staff determine what would be good assignments for volunteers and which ones maybe ought to be avoided or involve some danger, if you like. So I think they helped make our assignment process an awful lot better than it would have been, by the way. And the thing that really came to my attention in a very big way is when the Berlin Wall fell and we got invitations to put the Peace Corps first into Hungary, and then second into Poland, and then after that into every part of Eastern Europe, and then finally every part of the Soviet Union as it effectively came apart. This was mentioned earlier by Dan, the idea of the Peace Corps going in to the collapsing communist world, if you like, and I had a substantial role in that. The interesting thing about that is that in several cases, the Peace Corps was actually out ahead of the Foreign Service, because the Foreign Service didn't have enough people around to all of a sudden accommodate, the emergence, sort of the explosion on the world scene of 22, 23, it could say as many as 25 different countries, etc. They didn't have 25 ambassadors lying around ready to be recycled. So the Peace Corps ended up carrying out the Foreign Service assignments in a way that is being able to speak to the conditions in the countries, you know, such as the eastern part of the Soviet Union or former Soviet Union, or in places that the American public regarded as rather dangerous, like Lithuania and Latvia, and places that people hadn't even heard of before, like Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan. The Peace Corps was actually out ahead of the Foreign Service there and was helpful in getting the Foreign Service in place and ready and up and going as well, by just the staff sharing ideas and listening to each other. So we had a very, very good relationship with the Foreign Service, and it went two ways. It didn't just go one way, but it went two ways as we started up all these programs. Okay, sorry about that. The other thing I would say is, once our programs, those in the former communist world, and some of them are still there, and some of them have been shut down. For example, as soon as Putin became prime minister, they shut the Russia program down like a rocket, because he just saw it in intelligence terms and there was no other way to see it. And so it just had to be brought to an end, because, you know, he saw it as just a bunch of, I think we had 150 in the country when he shut it down. It's a bunch of spies running all over Russia, which they couldn't basically, you know, keep control of, etc. Anyway, the long and short of it is, some of the programs were shut down and some weren't. But nevertheless, some of them had been running for effectively 25, 28, 30 years practically. And those are now feeding people into the Foreign Service. The number of people entering the Foreign Service, you know, averaged out over a series of years is about 15%. And there are places that people, the families of the Foreign Service, really don't want to go. You can't, it's very hard to get Foreign Service officers assigned to Mongolia, for example. And we've had something like 300 volunteers go through the Mongolia program, and it's very popular. And they learn how to speak Mongolian very, very well. So if they recycle themselves into the Foreign Service, you can bet they're going to get a Mongolian assignment very early on. And the same applies to Turkmenistan, and the same applies to Uzbekistan and Moldova and Estonia and the like. They aren't places that American public is familiar with. They regard them as basically places where the amenities of society will be very few. In other words, it'll be far below American standards, and these places are regarded as inherently dangerous. And the Peace Corps who's been there can estimate whether they think it's dangerous or not. And of course, since they stayed, one assumes they've overcome the idea that these are dangerous places, because they're not any more dangerous than the other countries the Peace Corps serves around the world. So that's my take on the Peace Corps relationship with the Foreign Service. It's been overall quite good. The one tricky part over the long span of 60 years is American ambassadors are accustomed to the idea that whatever is American, or at least American government activity in the country where they are, they control it. And the American ambassadors don't actually have control of the Peace Corps. In other words, it is an independent agency. And while it cooperates, it's not under the formal control of US ambassadors. And many, many ambassadors over the years have learned to dislike this and tried to get around it as much as possible. And they've had to be dealt with, if possible, by the director or by the country director in country, etc. And it's a problem, I'm afraid, that's still out there, not entirely and completely resolved.
On the subject of how the Peace Corps has enriched the Foreign Service, I think there's a wealth of information out there. I think that the adventuresome nature of Peace Corps volunteers in general lends itself to becoming a very good Foreign Service officer. It's the kind of Foreign Service officer who goes to a post, whether or not he or she has any experience in the country, but wanting to get outside the walls of the embassy and meet people and get acquainted and learn more about that country and all its aspects. That's part of the job, yes, but it's also part of, just living in an overseas country. You don't just live in your American ghetto. and certainly foreign service officers, Peace Corps volunteers are not the only people who have that disposition. There are lots of wonderful foreign service officers who've come up through other channels. But I just think that there is, you can sort of tell a Peace Corps volunteer. At my first post in Sri Lanka, the DCM had to pull me aside very kindly and say, please don't wear sandals to the ambassador's residence. You learn there are things you do and things you don't do. But to the question which has been raised of the sort of percentage of RPCVs in the Foreign Service, I have a good friend who was ambassador in Malawi, and he told me a story once about how he was swearing in a new bunch of Foreign Service PCVs in Malawi, and he'd invited the whole embassy staff, and he asked all the RPCVs on the staff to stand up, and he said the entire USAID section stood up, and many of the rest of the Americans in the country. And he said he felt very, very proud at that point of his people and of the Peace Corps. The only other thing I'd say is I think it is worth mentioning a to me famous Peace Corps group, at least it should be famous. I think it was the second group in Nepal 2. It produced 3 American ambassadors, names of which you may well know: Vic Thompson, Peter Thompson, and Peter Burley. None of them were ambassadors to Nepal, but they all went on to very successful careers. And I think that's typical of the kind of Peace Corps volunteer who's successful.
Very good. Thank you for all of those wonderful answers. I do know that as we stand currently, there are nearly 70 individuals who are RPCVs who went on to become ambassadors in the Foreign Service. And of those 60-something, almost 70 individuals, there are about 6 who had the distinct honor of being assigned as ambassador to the countries that they previously served in as volunteers. Robert Gelbard of Bolivia was the first. And then David Greenlee, also Bolivia, followed him. Daryl Norman Johnson, Thailand. Thomas Hull, Sierra Leone. And I believe Kathleen Stevens. And Ambassador Allmeger, I know it was British Honduras, but you also were staffsperson, so I do count you among those 6.
That's right. Oh.
Yeah. Now, I do want to just ask one more question, because I do want to have time for it to be open to all the participants who joined us today, bringing it to the Peace Corps, Foreign Service, their connection, and where we are today. So it's been brought up that the documentary came out in 2019, and since then, a global pandemic has led to the evacuation of all 7,000 volunteers. Now the process is going to be the effort is going to be put into sending them back to the field eventually. What does the Peace Corps look like going into the future? What will and should it look like when it's celebrating its 70th anniversary? I suppose I want to just ask you how you all see that. It's been brought up that it should be focused on climate change, COVID-19 relief. Maybe Ambassador Allmeger, you are familiar with the Peace Corps volunteers and their role in recovery efforts after Hurricane Mitch in Honduras. Extreme weather events will become more and more normal going forward. So I do think that there is a capacity for the Peace Corps to stay relevant and adapt to these changes going forward. So if you could just answer that, and we'll move on to open questions.
Well, let me try by conveying some thoughts, including a point that I heard yesterday for the first time. As you know, all 7,500 Peace Corps volunteers were recalled from overseas in March of 2020 because of COVID. There have been a number of volunteers withdrawn from countries over the years, but never in the scale that we witnessed in March of 2020. The fascinating episode that I heard yesterday was that there was no U.S. government policy in early March, and at the same time, airports were beginning to close. There was fear or talk that there would be disruption of flights coming in from overseas. And it was on a Sunday midday that the then Peace Corps director, Jody Olson, and her staff began to talk about the situation, and the strong fear that you would wind up with 7,500 men and women overseas with the Peace Corps, and unable to bring them back in the context of a major world pandemic. So, as she points out, after having this discussion with her staff, this is now Sunday afternoon, and by 10 p.m. Sunday, she sent out a message to all of the World Peace Corps directors to mobilize their volunteers and bring them home as soon as possible. And in fact, every volunteer was brought back by the end of that week. Only about 5 wound up having COVID, and at least one of them had COVID in transit, if you will. And but the interesting thing is a decision that had Peace Corps been part of a larger entity, State Department, USAID, where decision making is more complex, where this autonomy that we were talking earlier does not exist, to focus on a problem and act on it immediately and have the solution in place by the end of that week, by having all the volunteers home, is an amazing story. As an old bureaucrat, I know how difficult it is to do this, but it is a testament to the resiliency of Peace Corps as an institution. And it goes back to a point that I made earlier that Peace Corps was able to stand up within less than a year and at least temporarily stand down in a week. And I guess subsequently she must have informed the White House and the State Department. And I suppose the old saying that it's better to ask for forgiveness than to ask for permission. And I'm sure that some of them may have reacted quite strongly about this, but yet the other element of the story, the significant element of the story, is that most of the volunteers wanted to go back as soon as possible, and more significantly, the host countries wanted them back. And so, as Peace Corps begins to prepare for this hopeful sign that they can go back, there will be communities out there waiting for them. And Peace Corps also was wise to leave the Peace Corps staff in place in all of those countries, in most cases being local employees, so that there will be very, very little downtime once the volunteers begin to go back. Now, many will not be able to go back just because life goes on and they're in school or in other jobs. But clearly, Peace Corps, as it always has to adapt to change. As an old timer, I got annoyed the first time that I heard that every Peace Corps volunteer had a cell phone or that had a laptop. Well, what do you mean a laptop or a cell phone? I had to stay in line, for a long time to get a phone connection to the Capitol, and that itself became so. Basically, a phone call to the Capitol, never mind to the U.S., took at least a day or so. And now these volunteers have it easy; they can just pick up their phone and call. But that's life, that's reality, and in many ways, of course, it brings them a number of tools that were not available to us old timers. And so the future of Peace Corps revolves around a world that has shrunk in the communication sense, but the assets available to the volunteers to do more is there. And so I would hope that those themes that we have talked about, climate change, world epidemics, and those kinds of issues that are real for everyone, will be a central part of the future of the Peace Corps. And I have no doubt that Peace Corps is here to stay, because if it went away, it would have to be reinvented all again. And so, yes, it will be different, but not necessarily moving away from the fundamental mission of the Peace Corps, which remains intact. And if I may, just because it comes to mind, I maintain a very close connection to returned Peace Corps volunteers who served in Honduras while I was there in the late 70s. And it's really amazing because we get together every couple of years or so, and so many of them have devoted their lives to things that they worked on as Peace Corps volunteers, whether it be forestry and the environment, watershed management, health practitioners. Every one of them was impacted by their Peace Corps experience and have brought back to the U.S. not only a sympathy for their service and the people they met there, but also with very useful skills that they have used in their own careers and in our own environment. So yes, Peace Corps is here to stay. I'm quite hopeful.
Thank you, Frank. Really terrifically interesting to hear a lot of new points that I hadn't considered. Well, I'm going to come at the gap, if you like. It's a 19-month-long gap when there haven't been any volunteers in the field anywhere in the world, and essentially say it's, of course, sad for it to go that long, because it's had, programmatic continuity in many places. In some places for practically 60 years, and other places for 40 years and 30 and the like. And it's really sad for there to be a break like this, etc. But it does present some opportunities. And the one opportunity that jumps right out at me is the Peace Corps has let go or stopped or given out of money to make TV ads announcing itself and its programs. And as a result of this happening, and the Peace Corps budget squeezing this kind of thing out, and the Ad Council sometimes giving free blurbs, if you like, about the Peace Corps, but generally doing it in the middle of the night, the American public has come to the view that the Peace Corps doesn't really exist any longer. Or alternatively, is it still there? I never heard about this. What's going on? We haven't heard anything about the Peace Corps, in years and years and years. And it's because nothing's been on television. This is a great time to see some of the money that's lying around unspent in the Peace Corps budget. And there is some, because of course there are no volunteers in the field. So a lot of the work that's paid for every year by the congressional appropriations is not being done, etc. And I'm sure some of the money is frozen, but some of the money is there to do necessary things with. And spending that money right now on 10 or 15 new, presentations about joining the Peace Corps, the toughest job you'll ever love, and that kind of thing. Get those things on the air and remind people that it's out there and that it's in abeyance for the moment, but it's coming back, and it's coming back better and stronger than ever. Now we're down to, of course, 6,100 volunteers this year. Obviously, the target has been 10,000. Indeed, the target when I was at the agency was, in fact, 10,000. And we never made it in my time, and we didn't make it in the 1990s or the 2000 to 2010 and 2010 to 2020. We never made it in 30 years, but it is the time now to really bear down on the 10,000 mark target and then plan beyond that as well. But to try to achieve that with the new momentum that I believe we ought to be able to generate by a period now of rethinking and improving on what the Peace Corps has done all of these years. And the rethinking program, in my opinion, is what is most relevant in all of these, if you like, third world or developing societies around the world where we can contribute. And one thing is very, very clear, and Frank just mentioned it a minute ago. The vaccination programs of the whole entire developing world are way behind the Western world. In some places it's not even gotten to 1% yet. And I don't think there are many that are above 5%. So they're way behind. And of course, largely not being able to afford the vaccine that's doing it. But we could get ready and have people helping in the vaccination program until they have reached their peak and their herd immunity or 100% if that's their national goal, etc. So we could get going and start planning for volunteers serving in national vaccination programs in the public health field. The need for computer skills in the developing world just keeps expanding just the way it does in the industrial world or in our world that we live in, etc. So we could basically, there's a world of people in the computer skills area that would love to have this chance to be overseas, and them teaching courses in high school or helping to teach civil servants how to use computers or helping to teach air traffic controllers how to use computers and the like. There's a world that we can do, and we've got a lot of people that are up and ready to go. We've done a little bit in this area, but this is an area that could be very fruitful, very impactful. Sorry. The next thing I want to do is say that we did a little bit over the first 60 years in teaching English or in English for specific occupations. And I think that is a gold mine of an area for us to work on, etc. English for occupations in the modern world. For example, English for the civil service, English for the diplomats of the particular country, Malawi, Bolivia, or whatever. They all need it, whether they like it or not, they need it, and it's something we can fill in. We have had experience with volunteers teaching English to courts, court reporters and judges. We've had volunteers teaching English to air traffic controllers. We've had volunteers teaching English to university staff. That is not necessarily the academics, though they can, of course, participate, but the staff of the university, which also needs English, and then, of course, to English in the business world. And there are a lot of other areas that we could talk about. So this idea of building up English for specialized occupations, I think, would be a really good chance for us to expand into something that's seen to be very, very valuable in the developing world. I think we also now need to start thinking about the problem that was mentioned right at the beginning. That is that we're really recruiting people who have liberal arts degrees and not much in the way of actual, programmatic experience, be it business or government or NGO or whatever it might be. I think it's possible that we could start recruiting volunteers at a higher level, a sort of technical level of skill, if you like, and basically people who we would expect to be in their 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, etc., and be able to participate in helping the volunteers behind them, and we should be able to help them in paying their bills. Some of these are people going to be going through graduate school and helping them pay for their MAs or PhDs or whatever it might be. In other words, rather than just depend on the post-college, amateur group that doesn't have much practical adult experience, we could start adding a new level of volunteer, a new technically achieved volunteer as well. So I leave that as my contributions, or at least I hope my contribution to the rethinking of the Peace Corps and what we're going to be doing when we get started again in probably the staffing part of it in 2022, probably in the summer or the fall, and then the volunteers in 2023. That's at least my estimate of what the future holds for us.
Daniel, I'd like to, as they say in Congress, yield back my time because I'd like to hear from our very knowledgeable audience. Tom Hushik just posted a very interesting piece about Afghanistan in the chat. I encourage everyone to read it and maybe post their own thoughts, but I hope you can open it up for questions now and comments. Thanks.
That's a great idea. Yeah, I do want to open it up to questions, and I also really appreciated Tom's anecdote as well. So in the interest of time, it would be great if questions could be directed at certain people, or if just one panelist could answer. But yeah, you can go ahead and unmute yourselves and just ask. Use the raise hand function or type your question into the chat box if you would like. Okay, John Killamere. Yes, please.
I just wanted to make two comments. I've been coaching new Foreign Service officers with AID for quite a while now, and I don't do a formal take, but I think probably 45% of or 50% of the new Foreign Service officers for AID over the last 2 years have been former Peace Corps volunteers. So those numbers are quite high in most of the technical areas and in the program areas, probably not on the controller side or the executive officer side. And finally, I wanted to mention in relation to getting along with agencies, getting along together. When my wife and I were serving in different posts as former Peace Corps volunteers, we would talk to the Peace Corps director and offer a room in our house as an ET room, an early termination room. So people who are considering early termination could come and spend a week or two with us and just relax if they wanted to talk to us, either of us or both, about their situation, or if they just wanted to relax, play with two little toddlers and see what an American family used to be like and have some American food, we would do that with them. And over the time within Botswana and Liberia, I think our record was about 50-50 going back to post.
Wow, good stuff.
Thank you, John. Would anybody else like to make a comment or provide a question for the panelists?
Let me just react to the point John just made about a large percentage of new recruits being our PCVs. That is terrific, because one of the challenges that not only the Foreign Service but government in general has these days is recruiting people to work for the federal government. It doesn't have the appeal, the engagement that brought so many of us into public service. And I would hope that Peace Corps could be a good source of future leaders in public service.
Very good. I saw Sean Donnelly of the BIAC.
Thanks. I was a volunteer in Tunisia in the 60s and went on to a long career in the Foreign Service. I was actually on the other end from Don Camp when the decision was made to pull Peace Corps volunteers out of Sri Lanka. I thought it was a terrible decision, and that comes to my question really to Don and Frank. Do you worry about how Peace Corps and the broader US government and the White House how much risk they'll be willing to sustain in today's more terrorist, riskier world? And because I don't think we can be credible as a country or as a Peace Corps program if we're on a yo-yo. Every time there's a threat of a hurricane or a threat that some local group in a country is going to do something bad, we're pulling all the volunteers out. Can Peace Corps going forward have the patience to ride through some risks? Or anyway, any thoughts on that would be appreciated. Thanks.
Someone earlier made the comment that Peace Corps is an independent agency, which is true. But we all know that when it comes to security, the State Department has a lot to say about it. And every administration comes in and says we're going to be less risk averse. We want to get people out there in the field, but it doesn't usually work out. I think the Peace Corps directors, I don't know what your experience was in Sri Lanka, Sean. The Peace Corps directors generally want their people to stay. They have the same perspective as the volunteers themselves. But you get the Washington bureaucracy involved, and the knee-jerk reaction is, I'm afraid, a little too much of the same.
I mean, my conversation with, I think it was Mark Garrett, was the Peace Corps director in whatever year that was, 97, 98. And it was all, how can I tell the senator, and all this, I'm getting deluged by calls from parents and all that. It wasn't debating the situation on the ground in Sri Lanka. It was the politics, the appearance, and we just can't take that risk. That was my take from the field. Anyway, thanks.
This is a major challenge, not just for Peace Corps, but for the Foreign Service in general. And of course, we've all seen Fortress America with the kinds of embassies and locations of those embassies that lead us further and further away from the action, if you will, and fewer opportunities for our Foreign Service colleagues to interact with the people in the country. it is a major concern. And of course, in the case of Peace Corps volunteers, safety of those volunteers obviously is critically important. At the same time, even under the best of circumstances, things do happen. Traffic accidents happen. Volunteers, many of them young, do things that young people shouldn't do, but do anyway. And so some things are going to happen. But fortunately, nowadays, again, even though I complain a little bit about the access to tools like cell phones, events like what happened in Bolivia, where a Peace Corps volunteer newly sworn in, this is in the 80s, or no, later, but more recently, was sworn in, and then 2 months later, the question was, where's John? And nobody could find him. That cannot happen and should not have happened then and now, but it is a legitimate balancing act that Peace Corps, along with the Foreign Service, will have to play in the coming years. But risk is inherent. The question is, how much risk can we take? And one of the specific challenges that I find is that whereas in the past, a problem would be communicated up the chain from let's say the volunteer up to his office in the capital city. Nowadays, the volunteer calls mom, and mom hears that her son is ill, and she's going to react as any parent would, saying, what's Peace Corps doing to get you better? And so this creates a constant challenge for Peace Corps staff, I'm sure. But accepting that there are risks, and that Peace Corps will do all it can to minimize those risks, we cannot walk away from the world. We have to be there. We don't want to put our volunteers in the middle of a war zone, but we certainly want to put volunteers where they're needed and can make a difference in environments that are not the healthiest of environments. I do wish Peace Corps staff well as it tackles this important subject of assignments in areas that are not as safe as we would like them to be.
Great, thank you. Can we go to Tom?
I just wanted to continue a little bit on the discussion about risk aversion. That anecdote I mentioned about Getty Vasquez's trip to Kabul in maybe February or March 2002. That was part of a Bush administration effort to really up the size or the number of volunteers in Muslim countries. I probably never was realistic that they would be able to move back to Afghanistan that early on when things were still so uncertain. But in retrospect, man, Americans were very welcome in Afghanistan right after the Taliban fell. It never got better than that window. And the Afghans themselves made an excellent case for it. Every single one of those people that were then leading the new government there had real fond recollections and personal stories about Peace Corps volunteers in their villages. And I do wonder what would have happened if we had somehow managed to get a contained program into Afghanistan in those days. I worked in a couple other countries as a Foreign Service officer that didn't have the benefit of ever having Peace Corps. Ambassador Allmeger, you mentioned, or no, maybe you, Jerry, mentioned that every part of the former Soviet Union got the Peace Corps. The exception was Tajikistan, where I served. They had a civil war right after the dissolution of the Soviet Union and never got Peace Corps. I was there 10 years after the end of that civil war, and it still was being treated as a place that was too insecure for Peace Corps volunteers, which I thought was a big mistake. That risk aversion, it ratchets up very easily, but it's very difficult to bring back down again. I finished my career in South Sudan, another place. I mean, they've had some terrible violence there, but not directed at foreigners. And there's Carter Center people that go out to the farthest cattle camps for their river blindness and guinea worm programs. There are other Americans out in the bush beyond the embassy's reach But, a Peace Corps program in a place like that, man, you couldn't get any better than that. But those aren't even on the table right now. The risk aversion is just too pronounced. I don't think putting the agency in with the State Department would help that at all. State Department itself is suffering quite a lot from risk aversion. So it just, there's going to have to be some risk taking. And I'm not really sure. Yeah, you don't want to put volunteers' lives or well-being at stake. But, there should be some more models than maybe a standard off-the-shelf model for opening a country program. So.
Yes, and now we go to Elizabeth Colton.
Yeah, hey, I see a lot of friends there. And I was one of those high school students when Kennedy announced in 1960 about the Peace Corps. And then in 1961, when it was established. And at that time, I said, I've got to do it. So as soon as I graduated from college in 67, I went in. And as many of you know, I've had a pretty amazing life of journalism and worked at the UN and Peace Corps and Foreign Service and many other things, and covering wars and diplomacy. I always say to people, and I just said it this morning, I was teaching out at Warren Wilson College here in Western North Carolina, and I was telling the students, they were asking me about my life. And I said, the Peace Corps, and I say this just this way, the Peace Corps was the greatest single experience of my life because it was all packed in and we had to be creative. I was in Kenya. And I will add, as some of you know, I'm extremely disappointed that you didn't think to have any women in this program. And honestly, from day one of the Peace Corps, women felt that there was some equality, but certainly it wasn't today. But I'm glad for the program. Thank you.
Thank you so much for saying that. I'm sure the panelists can respond as well. That was definitely, I feel very good about how this event went, but I do not feel good about not having included women or minorities, any other group that the Peace Corps really does value and has always tried to include to varying degrees of success. That's also an issue for the Foreign Service. And our discussions did not happen to intersect with those either, which is unfortunate. But I can say that going forward, ADST will make the commitment to do a much better job. And I hope that we can speak more later, Elizabeth, and we can include you in the next events going
Just
forward.
women.
Women as well,
Liz is right. Liz is right as she often is. I agree with her. Diversity is something that we're promoting in all aspects of life, and in the Peace Corps certainly. And it would have been good to have some diversity on this panel. That said, I would also like to agree with her on the value of the Peace Corps experience for those of us who have had it. I don't know that we've stressed it enough, but for me, as I guess for Liz, it was really a crucial turning point in my life and set me on a career, in this case, of the Foreign Service. So we should remember that, how much of a benefit it is for the individual volunteers.
I want to add to Liz's point too, about how the volunteer experience was a terrific thing for her, and I'm sure others that she talked to. I had, of course, a lot of country directors underneath me, 33 at one time and 28 and all the rest of it, and they turned over. So I often talked to them as they came out, when they'd finished their 2.5 or 5 years or 6 or whatever it was. And I had several who said, this is the greatest job I ever had. I'm just so sorry that I have to leave it because of personnel regulations and the like. I just think this is one of the great things that a human being can do, is get out there and run a Peace Corps program.
I definitely agree that it's just a wonderful experience, both as a PCV and then as Peace Corps staff and as director. And it's been absolutely great for me to have maintained very close ties with a lot of those volunteers who served while I was there. Both when I was a volunteer, those colleagues as volunteers, and then subsequently the volunteers for whom I was the director. And they've all experienced great things. Now, Going back to the film, towards the end, one of the last volunteers interviewed, or RPCVs interviewed, was from Honduras, or had been in Honduras. And she quoted a phrase that those of you who have served in Honduras have heard it frequently, allí no más. Allí no más means there, just a little bit longer, a little bit far away. It's a very common phrase in Honduras, maybe elsewhere in Latin America, allí no más. And the reason I thought about it is because we talk about working our way out of development assistance, and it's a legitimate concern. But in the case of the Peace Corps, Peace Corps is a lot more than development assistance. And we will never get to allí no más. We will never quite finish that long-term mission of better understanding among people around the world. And so the allí no más, or there a little bit longer, is going to be for the long haul. And I certainly hope that future leaders of the US government see the need to maintain this program, because it's vitally needed at home and abroad.
Very good. I think that's a great note to leave off of. And I'll just hand it back to Mark to kind of take us home and end on the note on the ADST. But I would like to thank all the questions. I would like to thank the panelists for sharing their time, their experience, and their insights, and also to the opportunity we had to all share in watching the documentary and discussing about it.
Well, thank you, Daniel, and thank you to the panelists and to the attendees for joining us. I just want to assure you this is one of many discussions. It will be an ongoing discussion that we hope to have. And in particular, I'll note that Liz Colton's point is very well taken regarding the appreciation for diversity that we have at ADST. And I think in this case, initially the panel was looking at US ambassadors who've also served in the Peace Corps. But it really highlights an important point that we bring up in our general discussions around diversity, whether it's in government or in the Foreign Service or in the Peace Corps as well. There is still work to be done, and it's through discussions and action that we can do so together. So I do appreciate the comments and people's honesty and the back and forth on this type of conversation. Officially, just on behalf of ADST, I just want to thank everyone for joining us. You can visit us at adst.org to subscribe to that weekly newsletter. Recommend us to friends, colleagues, or anyone that you know who is hungry for some diplomatic history every month. And please remember, ADST is a private nonprofit organization. We rely on the generosity of supporters across the country who are inspired by that nonpartisan mission that we have to capture, preserve, and share the experiences of US diplomats. So if you're joining us for the first time, it would be so great if you would signal your support by becoming a member or giving a donation in any amount for this kind of work that we do. We look forward to your participation at other events. Thanks again, everyone, for joining, and we wish you an excellent day.